Sometimes a mother's love means letting go, even when it breaks her heart into pieces. Sometimes a stranger's kindness can save two lives with a single choice. In the winter of 1847, outside a trading post in Colorado Territory, a starving young mother held her baby close. Her husband was dead. She had no food, no money, no hope. She found Ezra McCann, a mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness. "Please take my boy," she begged him. "Feed him." "I can't anymore." McCann looked at her thin face and crying baby. He thought of his own family lost years ago. The wind howled around them as he made his decision. He didn't just take the baby. He took them both. But why would a man who chose solitude suddenly choose family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The worn wooden cross in Ezra McCann's coat pocket had been there for 3 years, carved from the pine that grew beside 2 small graves high up in the Colorado mountains. He touched it now through the thick wool as he watched the young woman clutch her baby tighter against the bitter wind that swept down from the peaks. Sarah, she told him her name was Sarah Whitmore, and the boy was Thomas. The baby couldn't be more than 6 months old, all pink cheeks and thin wails that cut through the howling air like a blade through silence. Ezra had come down to Dutch Williams' trading post for supplies, coffee, salt, ammunition for his rifle. The usual necessities that brought him to civilization twice a year, no more. He'd been living alone in his mountain cabin since the cholera took his wife Margaret and little Emma in the summer of 44. 3 years of solitude. 3 years of speaking to no one but the wind and the pine trees that surrounded his home like faithful sentries. The trading post squatted against the mountainside like a wooden tick, all rough-hewn logs and patched chinking that barely kept the wind out. Dutch Williams had built it with his own hands 15 years back, when the territory was even wilder than it was now. The Dutchman was a good man, fair in his dealings and generous with credit when times were hard, which they often were in this unforgiving land. Inside, the post smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee beans and the wood smoke that perpetually drifted from the stone fireplace. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned goods, bolts of cloth, tools, and medicines. A few rough tables and chairs occupied the center of the room, where travelers could sit and warm themselves while conducting business. That's where Ezra had first seen her. Huddled near the fire with the baby wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Her dress had once been fine. He could tell by the cut and the quality of the fabric, but now it hung loose on her thin frame, patched and repatched until it was more mending than original cloth. Her brown hair, which might have been lustrous in better times, was pulled back severely and covered with a faded blue bonnet. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held the same hollow look he'd seen in his own reflection for 3 years, the look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered. "She's been here 2 days, Dutch had murmured to Ezra when he noticed his attention. "Husband died of the fever 3 weeks back, somewhere east of here." She walked most of the way, carrying the boy. "Been asking everyone who comes through if they know of work, any kind of work." Ezra had nodded, collected his supplies, and prepared to leave. He'd learned to harden his heart against such stories. The frontier was full of tragedies, and a man could go mad trying to ease every burden he encountered. But as he'd headed for the door, he'd heard her voice, soft and desperate, speaking to a fur trapper who'd just shaken his head and turned away. "Please," she'd said. "I can cook, I can sew, I can tend animals. I don't need much, just enough to feed my boy." The trapper had muttered something about having no use for a woman and child, especially not in winter, and had pushed past her to the bar where Dutch kept his whiskey. Other men in the post had studiously avoided looking in her direction, suddenly finding great interest in their drinks or their conversations. That's when Ezra had heard the baby crying, a thin, hungry sound that seemed to pierce something deep in his chest. He'd turned back, almost against his will, and seen Sarah trying to quiet the child with gentle shushes and soft words, though her own stomach was clearly empty. "When did you last eat?" He'd found himself asking, the words coming out gruffer than he'd intended. She'd looked up at him with those haunted eyes, and for a moment he'd seen not her face but Margaret's, pale and fevered in those final days. "Yesterday morning," she'd whispered. "Dutch gave me some bread, but I gave most of it to Thomas." That's when Ezra McCann, who'd sworn off human companionship, who'd chosen the isolation of the high country over the pain of caring about anyone ever again, had done something that surprised even himself. He'd bought food, real food, not just bread but beans and salt pork and canned peaches, and sat down across from her at the rough wooden table. "Eat," he'd said simply, and watched as she'd torn into the meal like a woman starving, which she was. The baby had quieted in her arms, as if sensing that help had finally arrived. They'd sat in relative silence as she ate, Ezra studying her face and trying to understand what was happening to the walls he'd built around his heart. She was young, maybe 25, with fine features that spoke of good breeding. This was not a woman born to hardship, he could see that clearly. She held herself with a dignity that even desperation couldn't fully erode. And the way she spoke to her child, soft, loving words, even in the midst of her own suffering, reminded him painfully of Margaret. "You got family back east?" he'd asked eventually. She'd shaken her head. "Samuel, my husband, we came west to start fresh. His family disowned him for marrying beneath his station," they said. "Mine," she'd paused, feeding the baby from a bottle Dutch had provided. "Mine are all gone. Consumption took them 2 years back." The baby had looked up at Ezra with wide blue eyes and something twisted in his chest. Thomas had his mother's coloring, but there was something in his expression, an alertness that reminded Ezra of his own Emma. She'd been 2 when she died, old enough to climb into his lap and demand stories, old enough to call him Papa in that sweet, piping voice that still echoed in his dreams. "Where were you headed?" Ezra had asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Anywhere," Sarah had said quietly. "Somewhere there might be work, somewhere safe for Thomas to grow up." She'd looked around the trading post, at the rough men nursing their whiskey and the harsh landscape visible through the frost-covered windows. "Though I'm beginning to think no such place exists." That's when the decision had crystallized in Ezra's mind, sudden and clear as mountain air. He'd spent 3 years running from the memory of family, convincing himself that solitude was safety, that caring led only to loss. But looking at this woman and her child, seeing the quiet desperation in her eyes and the trust in the baby's face, he'd realized that some things were worth the risk. "I live up the mountain," he'd said slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Got a cabin, good hunting, clean water. It's isolated, but it's safe." Sarah had stared at him, not understanding. "Winter's coming hard," Ezra had continued. "You and the boy won't survive it on the trail, and there's no work here for months yet. You could come with me. Help around the cabin, cook, mend things. I'd see you fed and sheltered until spring." The offer had hung between them like smoke from the fire, and Ezra had seen the struggle in her face. Pride warring with necessity, hope battling against a lifetime of warnings about strange men and their intentions. "I'm not looking for a wife," he'd added quickly, seeing her hesitation. "Lost my own family few years back. I know what it's like to have nowhere to turn." Something in his tone, or maybe in his eyes, had convinced her. She'd nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "All right," she'd said. "Until spring." But even as the words left her mouth, Ezra had known that spring was a long way off, and a lot could change in the months between now and then. He'd touched the wooden cross in his pocket, feeling its familiar weight, and wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life, or if maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to live again. The wind had picked up as they'd prepared to leave the trading post, driving snow before it like tiny bullets. Dutch had loaded them a pack mule with supplies, his weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. "You sure about this, Ezra?" the Dutchman had asked quietly, while Sarah bundled Thomas against the cold. Ezra had looked at the woman and child who were about to trust their lives to a stranger, at the baby's innocent face and the mother's weary hope, and felt something shift inside him like ice breaking up in a spring river. "No," he'd said honestly. But I'm doing it anyway. And as they'd set out into the swirling snow, beginning the long climb up the mountain to his cabin, Ezra McCann had carried more than supplies on his shoulders. He'd carried the weight of 3 broken lives and the fragile possibility that together they might find a way to become whole again. The trail up to Ezra's cabin was treacherous in good weather, but in the driving snow it became a test of endurance and will. Sarah walked beside the pack mule, Thomas bundled in her arms, while Ezra led the way with the sure-footed confidence of a man who'd traveled this path 100 times or more. Every few minutes he'd glance back to check on them, noting how Sarah's steps were growing shorter, how her breathing was becoming labored in the thin mountain air. They stopped twice to rest, taking shelter behind wind-carved rock formations that offered some protection from the storm. During the second stop, Ezra pulled his leather journal from his pack, a habit he'd maintained since Margaret's death, recording his thoughts and observations in careful, measured script. The journal was worn now, its pages filled with 3 years of solitary musings, sketches of wildlife, notes about weather patterns and seasonal changes. "What do you write about?" Sarah asked, noticing the careful way he handled the book. "Things that matter," Ezra replied simply, then surprised himself by adding, "things I don't want to forget." He showed her a page where he'd sketched a family of deer he'd watched through the previous summer, noting their habits and movements. Another page contained pressed wildflowers, mountain laurel and Indian paintbrush that Margaret had loved. It was the first time in 3 years he'd shared anything from the journal with another person. Sarah studied the pages with genuine interest, her finger tracing the careful lines of his drawings. "These are beautiful," she said. "You have real skill." Ezra felt heat creep up his neck. Compliments had been rare in his solitary life, and he'd forgotten how they could warm a man even in the bitter cold. "My Emma liked them," he said quietly. "My daughter. She'd sit on my lap while I drew, always wanting to help hold the pencil." The words hung between them in the thin air, the first real glimpse he'd given her into his loss. Sarah understood immediately. She recognized the particular pain in his voice because it echoed her own. How old was she? Sarah asked gently. 2. Just turned 2 the month before. He closed the journal carefully, the conversation going places he wasn't ready to explore. "We should keep moving." Storms getting worse. They climbed higher into the mountains, the wind howling around them like a living thing. The trees grew thinner as they ascended, twisted pines and scraggly aspens that looked like they were hanging onto life by sheer stubbornness. This was country that didn't forgive mistakes, where a wrong turn or a moment's inattention could mean death. But Ezra moved through it like he belonged here, reading the landscape the way other men read books. He pointed out landmarks to Sarah, a lightning-split pine that marked the halfway point, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a small meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring. She listened, storing away the information, beginning to understand that survival up here meant learning to read 100 small signs. "Why do you live so far from everything?" she asked during a brief lull in the wind. Ezra was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he said, "After Margaret and Emma died, I couldn't stand being around people. Everywhere I looked I saw families, her children laughing. It hurt too much." Sarah adjusted Thomas in her arms, feeling his small body warm against her chest. "But weren't you lonely?" "Loneliness was better than the alternative," Ezra said. "Or so I thought." The admission surprised them both. Ezra hadn't intended to reveal so much, but something about the intimacy of their shared struggle up the mountain, the way Sarah listened without judgment, made the words come easier. They crested a ridge just as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and rose. Below them, tucked into a natural bowl in the mountainside, sat Ezra's cabin. It was larger than Sarah had expected, built from massive pine logs, with a stone chimney that was already sending smoke into the darkening sky. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, and meant it. The cabin looked solid and permanent, a refuge carved out of the wilderness through determination and skill. "Built it myself," Ezra said with quiet pride. "Took most of 2 summers, but it's tight and warm. Got a good root cellar, even a small barn for the animals. As they descended toward the cabin, Sarah could see other signs of Ezra's careful stewardship. A garden plot, now dormant under snow, but clearly well tended. Split rails for fencing. A woodshed stacked high with seasoned timber. This wasn't the rough shelter of a hermit. This was a home built by a man who understood that survival in the mountains required planning and attention to detail. The cabin's interior surprised her even more. The main room was spacious and well organized, with a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. A kitchen area occupied one corner, equipped with a good stove and plenty of storage. Two smaller rooms opened off the main space, Ezra's bedroom and another that had clearly once been a child's room. Now serving as storage. You can have Emma's room, Ezra said quietly, noticing her gaze. I'll move the stored goods out, set up a proper bed for you and the boy. Sarah walked to the doorway of the small room, seeing the careful way Ezra had preserved it. Her child's rocking chair sat in one corner, a toy chest beneath the single window. The walls were decorated with more of his sketches, animals and flowers, fairy tale characters that a little girl might have loved. Are you sure? She asked, understanding what he was offering. Ezra nodded, though she could see the cost of the decision in his eyes. She's gone, he said simply, but maybe the room can serve life again, instead of just memory. Thomas chose that moment to wake up, his small voice rising in a hungry cry that filled the cabin. Sarah began to rock him, making the soft, hushing sounds that mothers have made since time began. And Ezra felt something crack open in his chest, not breaking but opening, like ice giving way to spring water. I'll get a fire going in the stove, he said, moving toward the kitchen. Get some food started. You must be exhausted. As Sarah settled into the rocking chair, Emma's rocking chair, and began to nurse Thomas, Ezra busied himself with domestic tasks he hadn't performed for anyone else in 3 years. The familiar routine of cooking and fire building took on new meaning with others to care for. The cabin, which had felt like a tomb for so long, suddenly seemed alive again. Later, as they sat around the table, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms, Ezra found himself studying their faces in the firelight. The woman looked younger now, with food in her belly and warmth around her. The desperate edge had left her features, replaced by something that might have been cautious hope. Thank you, she said quietly, meeting his eyes across the table. I know this isn't easy for you. Ezra touched the wooden cross in his pocket, feeling its worn edges. No, he agreed. But maybe that's the point. Outside, the wind continued to howl, driving snow against the windows and reminding them all of the harsh world beyond these walls. But inside the cabin, something new was taking root, fragile as a seedling, but real nonetheless. 3 people who'd lost everything were beginning to discover that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, you finally become free to choose what really matters. The leather journal lay open on Ezra's bedside table that night, its pages turned to a fresh entry. For the first time in 3 years, he'd written not about solitude and memory, but about the future and the possibility of hope. The child's wooden toy horse sat on the mantelpiece like a silent guardian, its paint worn smooth by small hands that would never touch it again. Ezra had carved it for Emma during the long winter nights, whittling away at a piece of mountain ash until it resembled the gentle mare they'd kept in the barn below. Now it watched over the cabin with glassy, painted eyes, a reminder of laughter that had once filled these rooms. Sarah noticed it on their 3rd morning together. While Thomas slept peacefully in the makeshift crib Ezra had fashioned from an old apple crate. She'd been exploring the cabin quietly, learning its rhythms and spaces, when her gaze fell upon the little horse. Something about its careful craftsmanship, the love evident in every carved detail, made her throat tighten with understanding. That's beautiful work, she said softly when Ezra emerged from the barn with an armload of firewood. He followed her gaze to the mantelpiece and stopped short, as if he'd forgotten the horse was there. For a moment, his face went through a series of small changes: surprise, pain, and something that might have been longing. "Emma's favorite," he said finally. "She'd carry it everywhere, making horse sounds and galloping it along the furniture." He set the firewood down carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Margaret used to say she'd grow up to be a horsewoman, like her grandmother back in Virginia." Sarah heard the past tense, the weight of dreams that would never come to pass. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward the horse. Ezra nodded, though she could see the tension in his shoulders as she lifted the toy from its place. The wood was smooth as silk, worn by loving hands. The carved mane flowed naturally, and tiny details, the suggestion of a bridle, the careful shape of the hooves, spoke of hours spent in patient craftsmanship. "She must have treasured it," Sarah said, turning the horse over in her hands. She did. Ezra moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "The night she died, she was holding it. Margaret had to. We had to pry it from her fingers." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. Sarah placed the horse gently back on the mantel, ensuring it faced the room just as it had before. It was then that Thomas began to cough. At first, it was just a small sound, barely audible over the crackling fire. Sarah turned toward the makeshift crib with the automatic attention of a mother, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The baby's face was flushed, his small chest working hard with each breath. "Thomas!" She lifted him quickly, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. The cough came again, harder this time, and she felt panic rise in her throat like bile. Ezra turned at the sound of her voice, saw the fear in her face, and crossed the room in 3 quick strides. He looked at the baby with the focused attention of a man who'd seen sickness before, who understood its signs and dangers. "How long has he been like this?" His voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "He was fine when I fed him this morning. Just a little restless. But babies are often—" The words tumbled out of her, desperate and frightened. "It's just a cold, isn't it? Babies get colds all the time." But even as she said it, Thomas coughed again, a deep, rattling sound that seemed too big for his small chest. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and when Ezra placed a careful hand on the baby's forehead, he could feel the fever burning through the thin skin. "We need to get this fever down," Ezra said, moving to the kitchen area. "Cool water, willow bark tea if I can get it into him." Sarah followed, still holding Thomas, watching as Ezra gathered supplies with the efficiency of a man who'd dealt with sickness in the wilderness before. But she could see something in his eyes, a haunted look that spoke of other fevers, other desperate nights. "Tell me what to do," she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "Strip him down to his diaper," Ezra instructed, preparing a basin of cool water. "We'll sponge him down, try to bring the fever down naturally, and keep talking to him. Babies fight harder when they hear their mother's voice." For the next hour, they worked together in tense cooperation. Sarah spoke to Thomas in soft, encouraging tones, while Ezra applied cool cloths to the baby's burning skin. The fever was stubborn, clinging to the small body like something alive and malevolent. "This isn't working," Sarah whispered, after Thomas had another coughing fit that left him gasping for air. "He's getting worse." Ezra looked at the baby's flushed face, heard the labored breathing, and felt a familiar cold dread settle in his stomach. He'd seen these symptoms before, had watched helplessly as they'd claimed the 2 people he'd loved most in the world. "It's not just a cold," he said quietly. "Looks like lung fever." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Lung fever was a killer, especially in babies. In the cities, with doctors and medicine, some children survived it. But here, in the isolation of the high country, with the nearest doctor days away through winter storms— "No," she said fiercely, clutching Thomas closer. "No, I won't lose him too. There has to be something we can do." Ezra watched her fierce protectiveness, saw the way she held her child like a shield against the cruelties of the world, and felt something break open in his chest. It was the same desperate love he'd felt. For Emma, the same helpless rage against death's arbitrary choices. "There might be," he said slowly. "Old Singing Wolf, the Ute medicine man, lives about half a day's ride south of here. He's got knowledge of herbs, treatments that white doctors don't know about." Sarah looked up at him with desperate hope. "Would he help us?" "Maybe." Ezra was already moving toward his heavy coat. "But I'd have to leave you here alone with Thomas. The trail's too dangerous for a sick baby, and you're not strong enough yet to make that kind of ride." The thought of being left alone with her dying child in a place she barely knew terrified Sarah. But the thought of losing Thomas terrified her more. "Go," she said firmly. "I'll take care of him until you get back." Ezra paused in his preparations, studying her face. 3 days ago, she'd been a broken woman begging strangers for help. Now, faced with her child's crisis, she'd found a core of steel he suspected she didn't even know she possessed. "There's a rifle above the mantel," he said. "Loaded and ready. Anyone comes around while I'm gone, you don't take chances. This country's got more than just weather to worry about." Sarah nodded, understanding. The frontier was no place for hesitation or false kindness. "The fever medicine is in the blue bottle," Ezra continued, gathering supplies for the journey. "Give him a few drops every hour. Keep him warm, but not too warm. And Sarah," he paused at the door, his hand on the latch, "keep talking to him. Tell him stories, sing to him. Let him know he's not alone." After Ezra left, riding into the swirling snow on his sturdy mountain horse, Sarah found herself alone, with her sick child in a cabin that still felt strange and foreign. Thomas's breathing was getting more labored, his small face flushed with fever that seemed to burn right through her when she held him. She settled into Emma's rocking chair, the one by the fire where the light was good and the warmth steady. The wooden toy horse seemed to watch from the mantel as she rocked Thomas, humming the lullabies her own mother had sung to her years ago. "You're going to be fine, little one," she whispered against his hot forehead. "Papa's gone to get help, and Mama's right here. You just hold on, do you hear me?" But as the hours stretched on and Thomas's condition seemed to worsen, Sarah felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had haunted her since Samuel's death. She'd lost her husband, her home, her security, everything except this precious child. The thought of losing him too was more than she could bear. She found herself looking at the toy horse on the mantel, thinking about the little girl who'd loved it, who'd died in this same cabin while her father fought desperately to save her. The parallel was too clear, too frightening to contemplate. "Not this time," she said aloud, surprising herself with the fierce determination in her voice. "This time is going to be different." Outside, the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, and somewhere in the darkness, a man who'd chosen to care again was racing through the storm, carrying the hopes of a makeshift family on his shoulders. Inside, a mother held her child close and refused to let despair take root, even as the shadows of past tragedy seemed to crowd around them like hungry ghosts. The toy horse watched it all with painted eyes, a silent witness to the eternal struggle between love and loss, hope and despair, that played out in the hearts of those who dared to care in a world that offered no guarantees. Sarah's wedding ring caught the firelight as she pressed cool cloths to Thomas's fevered brow, the simple gold band a reminder of vows spoken in happier times. She'd been twisting it unconsciously since Samuel's death, a nervous habit that had worn a pale groove on her finger. Now, as she tended her sick child in a stranger's cabin, the ring felt like both an anchor to her past and a chain holding her back from whatever future might await. Ezra had been gone 6 hours, and Thomas's condition had worsened. His breathing was shallow and rapid, punctuated by coughing fits that seemed to shake his entire small frame. Sarah had given him the fever medicine at regular intervals, but it seemed to have little effect. The baby's face was flushed and hot to the touch, and he'd stopped nursing entirely. "Come on, little one," she whispered, rocking him gently in Emma's chair. "You have to fight. Papa's coming back with help, but you have to hold on." The word Papa had slipped out without thinking, but it felt right somehow. In just 3 days, Ezra McCann had become more of a father to Thomas than the boy's biological father had ever had the chance to be. Samuel had died before Thomas could even focus his eyes properly, before the baby had learned to recognize his face or voice. Sarah found herself thinking about those last days with Samuel, how quickly the fever had taken him. One morning, he'd been planning their new life in Colorado, talking about the land they'd buy and the house they'd build. By evening, he was burning with fever, and within a week, he was gone. She'd been 6 months pregnant then, terrified and alone in a hostile landscape that seemed determined to claim everyone she loved. The sound of hoofbeats outside broke through her dark reverie. She looked up, hope flaring in her chest, but quickly realized it was too soon for Ezra to return. The rider was moving slowly, carefully, not with the urgency of someone racing to get help for a sick child. Sarah carefully placed Thomas in his makeshift crib and moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. In the pale afternoon light, she could see a lone horseman approaching the cabin. He was bundled in a heavy coat and fur hat, but something about his posture suggested caution rather than friendly intent. Remembering Ezra's warning, Sarah reached for the rifle above the mantel. It was heavier than she'd expected, but she'd grown up in a household where her father had taught her to shoot. The weight of it in her hands was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that she was truly alone in this isolated place. The rider stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and called out, "Hello, the house. Anyone home?" Sarah moved closer to the window, but didn't respond immediately. Something about the man's voice, too friendly, too casual, set her nerves on edge. "I saw smoke from the chimney," the man continued. "Just looking for shelter from the storm. Won't be no trouble." Thomas chose that moment to have another coughing fit, his small cry carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. The sound seemed to galvanize the rider, who dismounted and began walking toward the cabin with more purpose. "Ma'am, I heard that baby," he called out. "You got troubles in there?" "I might could help." Sarah's finger found the rifle's trigger. Every instinct told her that this man meant harm, but Thomas's condition was growing more desperate by the hour. What if this stranger really could help? What if he had medicine or knowledge that could save her child? "My husband will be back soon," she called through the door, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Well, that's fine," the man replied, but he kept walking toward the cabin. "Just thought I'd warm myself by your fire while I wait. Storm's getting worse out here." He was close enough now that Sarah could see his face through the window. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with pale eyes and a scraggly beard. But it was something in his expression, a calculating look, that reminded her of men who'd approached her after Samuel's death with offers of protection that made her decision for them. "Oh, you need to move on," she said firmly. "We don't have room for guests." The man stopped just outside the door and laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Come now, ma'am. That ain't very neighborly. Way I see it, you're all alone up here with a sick baby. Wouldn't want nothing to happen to you while your husband's away." The threat was clear, even wrapped in false concern. Sarah backed away from the door, checking to make sure the rifle was loaded. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm armed," she said, "and I know how to use it. You'd best be on your way." There was silence for a long moment, then the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. Sarah realized with growing fear that he was checking the windows, looking for weaknesses. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a predator who'd been watching, waiting for Ezra to leave. Thomas's coughing grew worse, and Sarah felt torn between protecting him and defending their sanctuary. She couldn't leave him alone to investigate the man's movements, but she couldn't ignore the very real threat outside either. The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the cabin, from the small window in Ezra's bedroom. Sarah's heart hammered as she heard the man forcing his way inside, cursing as he cut himself on the broken glass. "Now, don't do nothing foolish, lady," came his voice from the bedroom. "I just want to get warm. Maybe share some of whatever food you got. No need for anyone to get hurt." Sarah positioned herself between Thomas's crib and the bedroom doorway, raising the rifle to her shoulder. Her father's training came back to her. Breathe steady, aim center mass, squeeze, don't pull the trigger. But her hands were trembling, and Thomas was crying weakly behind her. The man appeared in the doorway, saw the rifle pointed at him, and smiled with genuine amusement. "Well now, look at you, playing the fierce mama bear." He took a step into the main room, glass crunching under his boots. "Problem is, ma'am, I don't think you got the stomach to actually pull that trigger." "Don't test me," Sarah said. But she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "See, that's where you're wrong about me helping," the man continued conversationally, taking another step forward. "I ain't here to help your baby, but I might be willing to take him off your hands, if you know what I mean. Some folks pay good money for healthy babies, and even sick ones sometimes recover." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. This man wasn't just a robber or a drifter looking for shelter. He was something far worse, someone who preyed on desperate families, who saw her child as a commodity to be bought and sold. "You get out of here," she said, her voice rising. "Get out now, or I swear I'll kill you." The man laughed again and took another step forward. "Lady, if you were gonna shoot me, you'd have done it already. Now why don't you just—" The rifle's report was deafening in the enclosed space of the cabin. The man staggered backward, looking down at the spreading red stain on his coat with surprise. Sarah had aimed for his shoulder, wanting to disable rather than kill, but in her nervousness, the shot had gone lower, catching him in the chest. He sat down heavily on the floor, his face pale with shock. You actually shot me," he said, as if he couldn't believe it. Sarah kept the rifle trained on him, working the lever to chamber another round. Her ears were ringing from the gunshot, and Thomas was wailing in his crib. But her hands were steady now. "I warned you," she said simply. The man tried to speak again, but blood was coming from his mouth now. He slumped to one side, and Sarah realized with growing horror that her shot had been more accurate than she'd intended. Within minutes, he was still. Sarah sank into the rocking chair, the rifle across her knees, and tried to process what had just happened. She'd killed a man, in defense of her child and herself, but she'd taken a human life nonetheless. The weight of it settled on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Thomas's cries brought her back to the immediate crisis. His fever was still raging, and now there was a dead man on the cabin floor and broken glass letting in the cold mountain air. She had to think, had to act, had to protect her child despite the chaos surrounding them. First she moved the man's body outside, struggling with his weight, but determined to get him away from Thomas. Then she nailed boards over the broken window, using tools she found in Ezra's workshop. The physical activity helped calm her nerves and gave her something to focus on, besides the enormity of what she'd done. By the time she'd finished cleaning up the blood and securing the cabin, Thomas had fallen into an exhausted sleep. His breathing was still labored, but he seemed slightly cooler to the touch. Sarah settled back into the rocking chair, the rifle within easy reach, and waited for Ezra to return. As she sat there in the growing darkness, Sarah twisted her wedding ring and thought about the woman she'd been just a week ago, the grieving widow who'd begged strangers for help, who'd been ready to give up her child rather than watch him starve. That woman seemed like a stranger now. In her place sat someone harder, someone who'd killed to protect what mattered most to her. The ring slipped off her finger more easily now, loosened by weight loss and the constant twisting. She looked at it in the firelight, this symbol of a life that was gone forever, and made a decision. Tomorrow, when this crisis was over, she would put the ring away. Samuel was dead, and she was no longer the woman who'd married him. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who could survive in this harsh landscape and protect the child who depended on her. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and somewhere in the darkness, Ezra McCann was racing back with help for a child he'd chosen to call his own. But inside the cabin, Sarah Whitmore was discovering that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from the help others provide, but from the courage you find within yourself when everything you love hangs in the balance. The hand-carved wooden spoon lay on the kitchen table like a small miracle, its surface smooth and warm from Ezra's patient work. He'd been whittling it during the long evening hours since their return from Singing Wolf's camp, shaping the mountain ash with careful strokes while Thomas slept peacefully in his makeshift crib. It was sized perfectly for a baby's mouth, with a shallow bowl that wouldn't overwhelm small swallows and a handle long enough for adult fingers to grip comfortably. 3 days had passed since Ezra's desperate ride through the storm to find the Ute medicine man. 3 days since Sarah had killed a man to protect her child and discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed. The crisis had changed something fundamental between them, broken down walls that might have taken months to erode under normal circumstances. Thomas was recovering well from his bout with lung fever, thanks to Singing Wolf's willow bark tea and prairie sage mixture. The old medicine man had studied the baby with ancient eyes, his weathered hands gentle as he'd examined the small chest and listened to the labored breathing. His remedies had worked where white man's medicine might have failed, and Ezra had paid him with gold coins and a promise of future friendship between their peoples. "The child is strong," Singing Wolf had told them in his careful English, "but it is more than medicine that heals him. It is the love that surrounds him. That is the strongest medicine of all." Now, watching Ezra test the spoon's smoothness with his thumb, Sarah understood what the old man had meant. This rough mountain man who'd sworn off human companionship was fashioning baby utensils with the patience of a devoted grandfather. Every evening, after the day's work was done, he'd sit by the fire and whittle something new. A rattle made from a hollowed gourd, a teething ring from applewood, small toys that would help Thomas develop his growing skills. "You don't have to do all this," Sarah said. Though her voice carried more gratitude than protest, Ezra looked up from his work, his eyes meeting hers across the warmth of the fire. "Boy's going to need proper things as he grows. Can't have him eating with his fingers forever." There was something different in his voice these days, something softer. The brittle edges that had characterized his speech when they'd first met were gradually wearing away, replaced by a warmth that reminded Sarah of melting snow in spring. "Tell me about your family," she said quietly. About Margaret and Emma. It was a question she'd wanted to ask since their first day in the cabin, but the timing had never felt right. Now, with Thomas healthy and sleeping peacefully, with the immediate crisis past, there seemed space for such conversations. Ezra set down the spoon and leaned back in his chair, his gaze traveling to the toy horse on the mantel. "Margaret was from Virginia," he said after a long moment. "Daughter of a horse breeder, came west with her brother when he decided to try his luck in Colorado territory. She was the kind of woman who could find beauty in a sunset, even when everything else was going wrong." Sarah heard the love in his voice, mixed with the pain that came from speaking of the dead. "How did you meet her?" "Her brother hired me to guide them up into the mountains. They were looking for good grazing land for their horses." Ezra smiled at the memory. "Margaret rode better than most men I knew, wasn't afraid of rough country or hard work. First woman I'd ever met who looked at these mountains and saw possibility instead of danger." "And Emma?" The smile deepened, tinged now with the particular ache that came from remembering a lost child. "Born 2 years after Margaret and I married. Came into the world hollering like a mountain cat and never really stopped making noise. She was," he paused, searching for words, "she was pure joy, that little girl. Could find something to laugh about, even on the worst days." Sarah watched his face in the firelight, seeing the way memory transformed his weathered features. "The cholera took them both." Ezra nodded, his expression growing grave. "Summer of 44, hot and dry, and the sickness came up from the settlements down south. Margaret got it first, then Emma. I tried everything I knew, herbs, poultices, prayers. Nothing worked." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I held them both as they died, buried them up on the ridge, where Margaret loved to watch the sunrise." The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. Thomas stirred in his sleep, making small sounds that drew both their attention. "He's lucky to have you," Ezra said, nodding toward the baby. "You fought for him in ways most folks wouldn't have the courage for." Sarah felt heat creep up her neck. She told Ezra about the intruder, about the shooting, but the memory still felt surreal. "I never thought I could do something like that." "Motherhood changes a person," Ezra said simply. "Makes you capable of things you never imagined. Is that what this is?" Sarah asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Are we playing at being a family?" The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then at Thomas, then at the small wooden spoon in his hands. "Don't know what we're playing at," he said finally. "But it doesn't feel like playing." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, like ice cracking on a winter river. "No," she agreed quietly, "it doesn't." Over the following days, they fell into routines that felt increasingly natural. Ezra would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check his trap lines, while Sarah cared for Thomas and managed the domestic tasks that kept their small household running. They cooked together, sharing the kitchen space, with an ease that surprised them both. Ezra proved to be skilled with simple meals, beans and cornbread, fresh trout when the fishing was good, venison from his hunting expeditions. Sarah contributed her own skills, mending clothes with careful stitches, organizing the cabin's storage areas with feminine efficiency, and adding small touches that made the space feel more like a home. She found wildflowers pressing between the pages of books and arranged them in small vases around the room. She baked bread with techniques her mother had taught her, filling the cabin with warm, yeasty aromas that seemed to chase away the lingering ghosts of loneliness. Thomas thrived under their combined care. His appetite returned with a vengeance, and he began to show the alertness and curiosity typical of a healthy baby his age. He would track their movements with bright eyes, gurgling contentedly when one of them spoke to him. Most remarkably, he seemed to respond equally to both Sarah and Ezra, reaching for either with small, grasping hands. "He knows us both," Sarah observed one evening, watching as Ezra fed Thomas with the new wooden spoon. The baby accepted food from the mountain man with complete trust, even opening his mouth eagerly when he saw the spoon approaching. "Children know who cares for them," Ezra replied, wiping a bit of mashed sweet potato from Thomas's chin. "Animals too. It's something deeper than words or explanations." As winter deepened around them, their small family found its rhythm. Ezra would read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice filling the cabin with stories from books he'd collected over the years. Sarah would sew or tend to Thomas while she listened, occasionally adding her own comments or observations. They talked about practical things, improvements needed for the cabin, plans for the spring planting, the best places to hunt and fish. But they also shared deeper conversations about their pasts, their hopes, their fears for the future. "Do you think he'll remember any of this when he's older?" Sarah asked one night, watching as Thomas slept peacefully in his crib. "Remember what?" Ezra asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "This time, these first months when he was so small, will he remember that you saved his life? That you chose to care for him when you didn't have to?" Ezra considered the question seriously. "Don't know about specific memories, but children remember how they felt, even if they can't recall the details. He'll grow up knowing he was wanted, knowing he belonged somewhere. That's more important than remembering any particular moment." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. Her own early memories were vague, but she retained a deep sense of having been loved and cared for by her parents. That foundation had sustained her through difficult times, had given her the strength to fight for Thomas when everything else seemed lost. "I want him to have that," she said quietly. "That sense of belonging, of being truly wanted." "He will," Ezra said with quiet certainty. "He already does." As the weeks passed, Thomas began to change in the way all babies do, growing heavier, more alert, more responsive to the world around him. The wooden spoon Ezra had carved became his favorite utensil, and he would wave his small hands excitedly when he saw it approaching. But more than his physical development, it was his obvious contentment that marked their success as an unlikely family. This was a child who felt secure in his world, who trusted the adults caring for him to meet his needs and keep him safe, and in caring for Thomas together, Sarah and Ezra found themselves growing closer in ways neither had expected. They developed a shorthand communication, able to anticipate each other's needs and responses. They shared the work without discussion of roles or responsibilities. It simply seemed natural that Ezra should handle the heavier tasks, while Sarah managed the more detailed domestic work. But there was overlap too. Ezra proved surprisingly gentle with baby care, while Sarah showed herself capable of outdoor tasks that required strength and endurance. "You're different than when you first came here," Ezra observed one evening, watching Sarah organize supplies with efficient movements. "Different how?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "Stronger. More settled in yourself, like you know who you are now." Sarah paused in her work, considering his words. He was right. She did feel different. The desperate, frightened woman who'd begged for help at the trading post seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone who knew her own capabilities, who understood that she could survive whatever challenges life might present. "Caring for something precious changes you," she said, echoing his earlier words. "Makes you more than you thought you could be." The wooden spoon lay on the table between them, testament to the small daily acts of love that were binding them together as surely as any formal vows. Tomorrow Thomas would use it again, guided by hands that had chosen to care for him. And day by day, meal by meal, their makeshift family would continue to grow stronger, rooted in love that had chosen to flourish in the harsh soil of the frontier. The tiny leather boots sat by the fireplace, their soft soles barely longer than Ezra's thumb. He'd crafted them from the finest deerskin during the long winter evenings, stitching each seam with the patient care of a master craftsman. The boots were sized for Thomas's first attempts at walking, still months away, but inevitable as spring following winter. They represented something more than footwear. They were a declaration of permanence, a statement of faith in their shared future. Spring had finally begun to show itself in the high country. The snow was melting in patches, revealing brown earth that would soon burst with new growth. Thomas, now 8 months old, had grown sturdy and alert under their combined care. He could sit up on his own, babble in the language all babies speak, and most remarkably, he'd begun to pull himself up to standing position using the furniture for support. "Won't be long now," Sarah said, watching as Thomas gripped the edge of his crib and worked to get his feet under him. His face was intense with concentration, his small jaw set with determination that reminded her powerfully of Ezra. "He's got your stubborn streak," Ezra observed, settling into his chair with his evening whittling. These days, he was working on a set of wooden blocks, carved with letters and simple pictures that would help Thomas learn as he grew. "My stubborn streak," Sarah laughed. "Have you met yourself, Ezra McCann?" It was the kind of easy teasing that had developed between them over the winter months, comfortable and warm as the fire that heated their cabin. They'd grown to know each other's habits and moods, the small details that made up daily life. Sarah knew that Ezra took his coffee black and preferred his eggs cooked hard. Ezra knew that Sarah hummed while she worked and always checked on Thomas one final time before going to bed herself. Thomas chose that moment to accomplish his goal, hauling himself upright and standing triumphantly beside his crib. He looked around with obvious pride, babbling excitedly at his achievement. "Well, look at that," Ezra said, setting down his knife and moving to steady the baby. First time standing all by himself. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the milestone. Thomas's first steps would come soon, and with them a whole new phase of childhood. She found herself thinking of all the moments Samuel had missed and would continue to miss. This standing, the first steps, the first words, the countless small victories that marked a child's growth. But then Thomas turned toward Ezra with a huge smile, reaching out his small hands to be picked up, and Sarah realized something profound. The man who was lifting her son with gentle strength, whose face lit up with pride at every small achievement. This man was Thomas's father in every way that mattered. Samuel's absence was tragic, but it no longer defined their lives. They had built something new, something complete. "Look what I finished," Ezra said later that evening, holding up the small leather boots. They were perfect, soft and flexible, with decorative stitching that spoke of hours of careful work. Sarah took them from his hands, marveling at their craftsmanship. The leather was buttery soft, treated with oils that would keep it supple. The soles were thick enough to protect small feet from rough surfaces, but thin enough to allow feeling of the ground beneath. Most touching of all, Ezra had embossed small designs on the sides, a mountain peak on one boot, a pine tree on the other. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "But he won't need them for months yet." "I know." Ezra's voice was gruff with emotion. "But I wanted to make them while I had the time. Before spring work gets too busy." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. The boots represented his commitment to being here for Thomas's first steps, to seeing the boy through all the stages of growing up. They were a promise made in leather and thread, a father's gift to the child he'd chosen to claim as his own. "He'll treasure them," she said, then added quietly, "We both will." The spring work Ezra had mentioned was indeed demanding. As the snow melted, there were repairs to be made, fences to mend and gardens to prepare. The cabin had weathered the winter well, but months of harsh weather had taken their toll. Ezra spent his days patching the roof, reinforcing the barn walls, and clearing fallen branches from around the property. Sarah found herself taking on more outdoor tasks as well. She helped with the garden planning, learning which vegetables grew best at their altitude and which could survive the short mountain growing season. Ezra taught her to recognize the signs of changing weather, to read the sky and wind for clues about coming storms. "You're becoming a real mountain woman," he told her one afternoon as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree. "Is that what I am now?" Sarah asked, pausing in her work to wipe sweat from her brow. She was wearing one of Ezra's old shirts over her dress, practical clothing that allowed for physical work. "What do you think you are?" It was a serious question, and Sarah considered it seriously. When she'd first arrived at the trading post, she'd been a widow, defined by loss and desperation. Now, watching Thomas play contentedly in the soft grass nearby while she and Ezra worked side by side, she felt like someone entirely different. "I think I'm home," she said simply. The word hung between them. Loaded with meaning, neither was quite ready to fully explore. Home implied permanence, belonging, a future planned together rather than simply survived one day at a time. "This place suits you," Ezra said carefully. "Both of you." It was as close as either had come to discussing their long-term arrangement. The original plan, shelter until spring, had long since become something more, but neither had spoken directly about what would happen when travel became easier and other options became available. That evening, as they sat around the fire after Thomas had been put to bed, Sarah found herself studying Ezra's profile in the flickering light. He was reading aloud from one of his books, Longfellow's poetry this time, his deep voice giving music to the verses. She'd grown to love these quiet evenings, the peaceful domesticity they'd created together. "Ezra," she said during a pause between poems. "Yes? When you made those boots for Thomas, were you thinking about him learning to walk here, in this place?" Ezra closed the book slowly, marking his place with a careful finger. "I was thinking about being here to see it, being part of it. And if we weren't here, if circumstances changed." The question was delicate, touching on fears neither had fully voiced. What if Sarah decided to leave? What if outside pressures forced changes in their arrangement? What if the fragile family they'd built proved too fragile to last? "Then I'd want to be wherever you and Thomas were," Ezra said quietly. "If you'd have me." The admission surprised them both. Sarah felt her heart skip, recognizing the declaration for what it was, not quite a proposal, but something approaching one. "The people in town," she said hesitantly. "When we go down for supplies, they look at us. Wonder about our arrangement, let them wonder. But what if they think, Sarah?" Ezra's voice was gentle but firm. "What do you think? About us? About this life we're building?" She looked at him across the firelight, this rough mountain man who'd become the center of her world. He'd saved her life and Thomas's, had opened his home and heart to strangers, had shown them both what it meant to be truly cared for. "I think," she said slowly, That Thomas is lucky to have you as a father. That I'm lucky to have you as—" She paused, searching for the right word. "As what?" "As whatever you want to be to us." It wasn't quite an answer to the question he hadn't quite asked, but it was enough for now. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them, each lost in thoughts of the future they were carefully building together. Outside, spring continued its slow advance up the mountainside. Soon the high meadows would be green with new grass. The streams would run full with snowmelt, and Thomas would take his first tottering steps in the soft leather boots that waited by the fire. The boots that represented everything they dared to hope for: continuity, belonging, and the simple faith that love could indeed grow strong in the harsh soil of the frontier. Later that night, as Sarah tucked the small boots carefully away for future use, she realized they'd become more than just footwear. They were a symbol of the life she'd chosen, the man she'd learned to trust, and the family they were creating one careful day at a time. Thomas might not remember his first shoes, but she would remember the love that had crafted them, stitch by patient stitch. In the warm light of a mountain cabin where 3 lost souls had found their way home, the roughly carved wooden cross stood weathered and simple on the ridge above their cabin, marking 2 graves that had been carefully tended despite their owner's long absence. Ezra's hands shook slightly as he brushed away the winter debris that had accumulated around the markers, revealing the names carved with painstaking care: Margaret McCann, beloved wife, and below it Emma McCann, our precious daughter. Sarah stood a few steps behind him, Thomas riding contentedly on her hip, giving Ezra the privacy of his grief while still offering her silent support. It was the first time he'd brought them to this sacred place, the first time in 3 years he'd been able to face these graves with anything other than crushing guilt and despair. "I should have protected them better," Ezra said quietly, his voice carried away by the mountain wind. "Should have taken them down to the settlements when the sickness started spreading. Should have done something, anything different." "You did everything you could," Sarah replied gently. "Sometimes that's not enough, and it's not your fault." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of her own experience with loss and the helpless rage that came with watching someone you love slip away despite your best efforts. Samuel's death had taught her that tragedy struck without regard for what people deserved or how hard they fought against it. Ezra knelt beside Margaret's grave, his weathered hands tracing the carved letters. "She loved it up here. Said the mountains made her feel closer to heaven." He paused, then looked up at Sarah with eyes full of pain and something that might have been hope. "I stopped coming here after they died. Couldn't bear it. But today, I wanted them to meet you and Thomas." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes at the simple dignity of the gesture. She moved closer, shifting Thomas to one arm so she could place her free hand on Ezra's shoulder. "Hello, Margaret," she said softly, addressing the grave directly. "I'm Sarah. I want you to know that Ezra is taking wonderful care of us. He's a good man and a loving father to Thomas." Thomas, as if sensing the solemnity of the moment, was unusually quiet, his blue eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. The baby reached out one small hand toward the wooden cross, and Ezra gently guided his tiny fingers to touch the weathered wood. "That's your sister Emma's grave." "Little man," Ezra said, his voice thick with emotion, "she would have loved playing with you, teaching you things. She was just about your age when she went to be with the angels." The wind sighed through the pine trees that surrounded the small cemetery, carrying with it the sense of spring, new growth, melting snow, the promise of warmer days ahead. It seemed fitting that this moment of acknowledgement, of finally allowing the past to meet the present, should come as the world was renewing itself. "I used to talk to them," Ezra admitted, settling back on his heels. "Tell them about my day, ask their advice about things. Haven't done that in a long time." "Maybe you could start again," Sarah suggested. "I think they'd like to know about Thomas, about the family you're building." The word family hung in the air between them, still new enough to feel both thrilling and terrifying. They'd been dancing around it for months, this thing they were becoming. But neither had been brave enough to name it directly. Margaret always wanted more children, Ezra said, looking at Thomas with an expression of wonder. Said the cabin was too quiet with just one little voice in it. She would have loved the sound of a baby laughing again. As if summoned by his words, Thomas chose that moment to giggle, a pure sound of delight that echoed off the surrounding rocks. He was reaching for a butterfly that had landed nearby, his small face bright with curiosity and joy. She hears him, Sarah said with quiet certainty. They both do. They spent another hour at the gravesite. Ezra telling Margaret and Emma about their winter together, about Thomas's recovery from the lung fever, about Sarah's strength and courage during the crisis with the intruder. Sarah listened, learning more about the man he'd been before loss had driven him into isolation, understanding better the depth of love that had shaped him. I was afraid, Ezra admitted, as they prepared to leave, afraid that caring again would dishonor their memory somehow. Like I was trying to replace what we had. Love doesn't replace love, Sarah said firmly. It adds to it. Margaret and Emma will always be part of you, part of your story. But that doesn't mean your story has to end with their deaths. Ezra looked at her with something approaching amazement, as if she'd spoken a truth he'd needed to hear but couldn't find for himself. How did you get so wise? Pain teaches wisdom if you let it. If you don't let it make you bitter instead. The walk back to the cabin was different from their climb up to the ridge. There was a lightness in Ezra's step that hadn't been there before, as if he'd finally been able to set down a burden he'd been carrying for too long. Thomas babbled contentedly from his perch on Sarah's hip, pointing at birds and clouds with the wonder that only children possess. That evening, as they sat around their fire, Ezra pulled out his leather journal and began to write. Sarah could see him occasionally glancing toward the ridge where the graves lay, as if including Margaret and Emma in his thoughts about their current life. "What are you writing?" she asked gently. "A letter of sorts." "To Margaret," he paused, considering his words. "Telling her about you and Thomas, about how you've brought life back to this place. Asking her to watch over all of us." The gesture touched Sarah deeply. She understood that this was Ezra's way of integrating his past with his present, of honoring his first family while embracing his second. It spoke to the kind of man he was, someone who loved completely, who didn't forget or abandon those who depended on him. "I have something for you," Sarah said, moving to the trunk where she kept her few personal belongings. She withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth and handed it to Ezra. Inside was her wedding ring, polished to a bright gleam. But more than that, she'd had it altered somehow, engraved with tiny pine trees around the band. Mountain symbols that spoke of this place and this life they'd built together. "I was married before," she said simply, "but I want to be married again, to you, if you'll have me." Ezra stared at the ring, understanding immediately what she was offering. Not just herself, but a formal recognition of what they'd become, a public acknowledgement of their commitment to each other and to Thomas. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you sure?" "This life, this place. It's not easy." "I'm sure." She knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "I've never been more sure of anything. You've shown me what love looks like when it's given freely, without conditions or expectations. You've been a father to Thomas when he needed one most. This is where I belong, where we belong." Ezra looked from the ring to her face, seeing there the same certainty he felt in his own heart. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I'll have you, both of you, for as long as you'll stay." The proposal, if it could be called that, was nothing like the romantic gestures Sarah had read about in books. There were no flowery speeches or grand gestures, just two people who'd found each other in the wilderness and recognized that what they'd built together was worth protecting and celebrating. Thomas, seeming to sense the importance of the moment, clapped his hands together and babbled something that sounded almost like yes, making them both laugh. "I think he approves," Sarah said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Of course he does," Ezra replied, pulling them both into his embrace. "He's got good sense for someone who can't even walk yet." Outside, the mountain wind continued to whisper through the pines. carrying their joy up to the ridge where two wooden crosses stood as silent witnesses to the enduring power of love. Margaret and Emma were part of their story now, woven into the fabric of this new family that was choosing to be born from the ashes of loss. The roughly carved cross seemed to catch the moonlight as it stood watch over the sleeping valley, a reminder that some bonds transcend death, and that the greatest honor we can give to those we've lost is to continue loving, continue hoping, continue building lives worthy of the gifts we've been given. The legal document crackled in Sarah's trembling hands, its formal language and official seals seeming impossibly out of place in their rustic mountain cabin. The lawyer who delivered it sat uncomfortably on their rough-hewn furniture, his city clothes and soft hands marking him as clearly as a sign that he didn't belong in this wild country. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said in his precise Eastern accent, "I realize this must come as quite a shock. But the inheritance is substantial, nearly $15,000, plus the property in Boston. Your great-aunt Cordelia was apparently quite fond of you, despite the distance." Sarah stared at the papers, trying to process the impossibility of it all. 3 days ago, her greatest concern had been whether Thomas would take his first steps before or after their planned wedding ceremony. Now she held the key to financial independence that could change everything about their carefully constructed life. "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Aunt Cordelia barely knew me. I hadn't heard from her in years. According to her will, she followed your situation through mutual acquaintances. She was particularly distressed to learn of your husband's death and your current circumstances." The lawyer's gaze swept the cabin with barely concealed disapproval. "She wanted to ensure you had the means to return to civilization and raise your child properly." The words stung, even coming from a stranger. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. "My child is being raised properly, sir. Perhaps more properly than many children in your civilized cities." Ezra, who had been standing silently by the window, stepped forward at the defensive tone in her voice. Thomas, playing contentedly with his wooden blocks on the floor, looked up at the tension in the room with curious eyes. "What exactly does this inheritance require?" Ezra asked, his voice carefully neutral. The lawyer consulted his papers again. "Mrs. Whitmore must return to Boston within 6 months to claim the property and establish residency. There are also conditions regarding the child's education and circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" Sarah demanded. "Well," the lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably, "your great-aunt was quite specific about providing proper moral guidance for the child. She felt that your current arrangement might not be in the boy's best interests." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt her temper flare. "My arrangement, as you call it, is with a good man who has shown us nothing but kindness and protection." "Nevertheless," the lawyer continued, "the will stipulates that the inheritance is contingent upon your return to respectable society. There are conditions about the child's guardianship as well." "Guardianship?" Ezra's voice was sharp now. "What about guardianship?" The lawyer looked even more uncomfortable. "The will provides for approved guardians to be appointed if Mrs. Whitmore's circumstances don't meet certain standards. Your great-aunt wanted to ensure the child had proper advantages, education, social connections, opportunities that simply aren't available in places like this." Sarah felt the room spinning around her. She looked at Thomas, happily absorbed in his play, unaware that his future was being discussed like a commodity to be traded. Then she looked at Ezra, seeing in his face the dawning realization that their fragile happiness was under threat. "And if I refuse the inheritance?" she asked quietly. "Then it passes to other heirs, and you receive nothing." Your great-aunt was quite firm about that, the silence stretched taut as a bowstring. $15,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It could provide Thomas with education, opportunities, a secure future, in ways that life on the frontier never could. But it would mean leaving Ezra, leaving the only place that had felt like home since Samuel's death. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said finally. "Of course." But I should mention that there are other parties interested in the outcome. The lawyer glanced meaningfully at Ezra. Mrs. Whitmore's late husband had debts that were never fully settled. Creditors who have been patient. Because of your circumstances, Sarah's blood turned cold. What debts? Samuel never mentioned business investments that went badly. Loans taken out against future prospects. The amounts are significant and with interest. The lawyer named a figure that made Sarah gasp. But I don't have that kind of money, she whispered. No, but the inheritance would more than cover it. And there are legal protections for widows who claim their rightful inheritances. However, if you remain in your current situation, he let the implication hang in the air. Ezra stepped closer to Sarah, his presence solid and reassuring. Are you saying she'd be forced to pay debts that weren't hers? I'm saying that creditors have ways of collecting what they're owed, particularly from someone in vulnerable circumstances. The threat was clear, wrapped in legal language, but unmistakable. Accept the inheritance and its conditions, or face financial ruin that could destroy not just Sarah, but potentially Ezra as well. After the lawyer left, promising to return in a week for Sarah's decision, the cabin felt strange and unfamiliar. Thomas continued playing, unaware that his world had just been turned upside down. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the legal documents as if they might change their meaning if she looked hard enough. $15,000, she said quietly. It's more money than most people ever see. It is, Ezra agreed. Settling into the chair across from her, it could give Thomas everything. Education, opportunities, a chance at a different kind of life. It could. Sarah looked up at him, frustrated by his careful neutrality. What do you think I should do? Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the legal papers to Thomas, then to Sarah's face. I think, he said finally, that you have to decide what kind of life you want for yourself and Thomas. What kind of mother you want to be? What do you mean? Do you want to be the kind of mother who gives her child money and opportunities, but teaches him that love can be bought and sold? Or do you want to be the kind who shows him that some things, family, loyalty, belonging, are worth more than money? Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. But the debts, Ezra. If I don't take the inheritance, Samuel's creditors could come after everything. They could take the cabin, could destroy what we've built here. Let them try. Ezra's voice was quiet but firm. This land is mine, bought and paid for. And I'll be damned if I let some Eastern creditors destroy our family over debts that died with your husband. The word family hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's what they were, she realized. Not a convenient arrangement or a temporary shelter, but a real family bound together by choice and love and mutual commitment. But Thomas, she whispered, the opportunities he could have in Boston, the education, the advantages, he'll have advantages here too, Ezra said firmly. He'll know how to work with his hands, how to read the land and weather, how to be strong and self-reliant. He'll grow up knowing he was wanted and loved. Not because of what he could inherit, but because of who he is. Thomas chose that moment to pull himself up to standing, using the table leg for support. He grinned at them both, proud of his achievement, and babbled something that sounded almost like Mama and Papa. Sarah burst into tears then, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the choice she faced. Everything she'd thought she wanted for Thomas, security, education, a respectable future, was being offered to her on a silver platter. But the cost would be giving up everything she'd actually found: love, belonging, a man who'd chosen to be a father to her child without thought of reward or advantage. I don't know what to do, she sobbed. I don't know how to choose. Ezra came around the table and pulled her into his arms, holding her close while she cried out her confusion and fear. Thomas, sensing his mother's distress, made small worried sounds and reached up to pat her leg with his tiny hand. You don't have to decide right now, Ezra said gently. We have time to think, to plan. Maybe there's another way, something that lawyer didn't tell us about. But even as he spoke, they both knew the truth. The choice was stark and unavoidable. Security and respectability in Boston, or love and uncertainty in the mountains. There was no middle ground, no compromise that would let them have both. That night, as they lay in their separate beds, listening to Thomas's peaceful breathing, both Sarah and Ezra stared at the ceiling and wondered if love was really enough to overcome the practical realities of life in an unforgiving world. The legal documents lay on the kitchen table like a declaration of war against everything they'd built together. A reminder that sometimes the greatest threats to happiness came not from the wilderness they'd tamed, but from the civilization they'd left behind, outside. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of spring and the promise of new beginnings. But inside the cabin, 3 hearts that had learned to beat as one faced the possibility that legal obligations and financial pressures might prove stronger than the bonds they'd forged in their isolated sanctuary. Ezra's father's hunting rifle lay across his knees like a bridge between past and present, its worn stock polished smooth by 3 generations of McCann hands. He'd taken it down from its place above the mantel after the lawyer's visit, not out of any immediate threat, but because holding it helped him think. His father had carried this rifle through the Civil War, had used it to feed his family during the lean years afterward, had passed it to Ezra with words about legacy and responsibility. Now, as he sat on the cabin's front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, Ezra wondered what legacy he was leaving for Thomas, and whether that legacy would survive the legal storm gathering around them. 3 days had passed since the lawyer's visit, and the tension in the cabin was thick as mountain fog. Sarah moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, caring for Thomas with her usual devotion, but speaking little about the impossible choice she faced. The legal documents remained on the kitchen table like an unwelcome guest that no one had the courage to ask to leave. "You're up early," Sarah's voice came from the doorway behind him, soft, with the particular gentleness that had become second nature between them. "Couldn't sleep." Ezra shifted the rifle carefully, making room for her beside him on the rough wooden bench. "Been thinking about my father." Sarah settled beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth in the cool mountain air. "What about him?" "He fought at Shiloh and Tetum, 6 other battles whose names I can barely pronounce. Came home with this rifle and scars that never fully healed." Ezra ran his hand along the weapon's barrel. "But you know what he told me about courage? He said it wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what needed doing, even when you were scared to death." Sarah heard the unspoken question in his words. "What do you think needs doing now?" Before Ezra could answer, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning stillness. They sat up straighter, alert to potential danger, as 3 riders emerged from the tree line. Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the lawyer from Boston. But the 2 men with him were strangers, hard-faced men who rode like they were comfortable with trouble. "Mrs. Whitmore," the lawyer called as he dismounted, "I hope you've had time to consider our offer." Ezra stood slowly, the rifle cradled in his arms, in a way that wasn't quite threatening, but wasn't exactly friendly either. "Bit early for social calls, don't you think?" One of the hard-faced men spoke up. "We're here on business. Mrs. Whitmore owes money to people who don't like to wait." "Samuel's debts," Sarah said quietly, stepping closer to Ezra. She'd known this moment would come, but facing it still felt like a physical blow. "Your debts now, ma'am," the man continued. "Husband dies, debts pass to the widow. That's the law. Only if she has assets to claim," the lawyer interjected smoothly. "Which is why the inheritance becomes so important. It would resolve all outstanding obligations and provide for your future security." Thomas began crying from inside the cabin, as if sensing the tension outside. Sarah moved toward the door, but one of the debt collectors blocked her way. "Boy stays here while we talk," he said. "Want to make sure everyone understands what's at stake." Ezra's grip tightened on the rifle. "The boy goes to his mother." The 2 men sized each other up across the space between them, and Sarah felt the situation spinning toward violence. She could see in Ezra's face the same cold determination she'd glimpsed when he'd first agreed to help her, the quiet strength that had carried them through every crisis they'd faced. "Let me get him," she said quickly. "Please, he's just a baby." The debt collector nodded grudgingly and Sarah hurried inside. Thomas was standing in his crib, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. She lifted him quickly, feeling his small arms wrap around her neck with desperate trust. When she returned to the porch, the confrontation had escalated. Ezra had shifted position slightly, and Sarah noticed he now had a clear line of sight to both strangers while keeping his back to the cabin wall. "The way I see it," one of the debt collectors was saying, "you got 3 choices, lady. Take the inheritance and pay what's owed. Sign over custody of the boy to guardians who can provide for him proper. Or watch us foreclose on everything you got, including this place." "This land isn't hers to lose," Ezra said quietly. "It's mine, and I didn't take on any man's debts. You take on his woman, you take on his obligations. That's how it works out here." Sarah felt the conversation slipping away from her, becoming something between Ezra and these men that she couldn't control. Thomas whimpered in her arms, and she realized he was sensing her fear. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Some arrangement, there is," the lawyer interrupted. "Take the inheritance. Return to Boston with the child. Start fresh with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. And leave Ezra with nothing. Leave Mr. McCann with what he had before, a mountain cabin and solitude. Some might say that's what he prefers anyway." Sarah looked at Ezra, seeing the pain flash across his face at the casual dismissal of what they'd built together. In that moment, she realized something crucial. She'd been approaching this choice all wrong. She'd been weighing Thomas's financial future against their family's happiness, as if those were the only considerations that mattered. But there was something else at stake, something the lawyer and debt collectors couldn't understand because they'd never lived it. There was the question of what kind of man Thomas would grow up to be, what lessons he would learn about loyalty and love and the value of commitments that couldn't be bought or sold. "I need to see the original debt documents," she said suddenly. "Before I make any decision, I want to see exactly what Samuel owed and to whom." The debt collectors exchanged glances. "Lady, you don't understand how this works." "I understand perfectly," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "But I also understand that debts can be disputed, and that widows have legal protections that you might not want to test in court." It was a bluff, based on half-remembered conversations she'd overheard between Samuel and his business associates. But she saw something flicker in the debt collectors' faces, uncertainty, perhaps even worry. "You got 1 week, one of them said finally. "After that, we start collecting one way or another." After the men rode away, Sarah and Ezra sat in silence on the porch, Thomas playing contentedly with his wooden blocks at their feet. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the mountain peaks in shades of gold and rose, but the beauty felt fragile now, threatened by forces beyond their control. "I'm not going to Boston," Sarah said finally. "Whatever happens, whatever it costs, I'm not taking Thomas away from the only father he's ever known." Ezra looked at her with something between relief and fear. "Sarah, if those men are serious about collecting, then we'll face it together, all of us." She reached for his hand, twining their fingers together. "You said your father taught you about courage. Well, this is mine. Choosing love over security, family over money, even if it means losing everything." Sarah looked down at Thomas, who had managed to stack 3 blocks before knocking them over with a delighted laugh. She thought about the tiny leather boots waiting for his first steps, about the toy horse on the mantel that watched over their daily lives, about all the small acts of love that had built their family from nothing but need and hope. "We won't lose everything," she said firmly. "We might lose money or land or comfort, but we won't lose each other. And that's what matters most." Ezra lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we'd better start planning. If those men come back with force, we need to be ready." The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation. Ezra cleaned and loaded his weapons, checked the cabin's defenses, and made plans for getting Sarah and Thomas to safety if violence erupted. Sarah wrote letters to the territorial judge, to friends back east who might have influence, to anyone who might help them navigate the legal maze they faced. But more than that, they talked about their fears, their hopes, their determination to protect what they'd built together. They spoke of practical matters, how to hide their few valuables, where Thomas could be safe if trouble came, which neighbors might offer help despite the risks. As evening fell, Sarah found herself standing in the doorway of Thomas's room, watching Ezra read to the baby from one of his carefully preserved books. The scene was so ordinary, so peacefully domestic, that it seemed impossible that it might be torn away from them by legal documents and financial obligations. "He trusts you completely," she observed, noting how Thomas reached for Ezra's face with small, curious fingers. "Children know who loves them," Ezra replied, gently moving the baby's hand away from his beard. "It's a gift they're born with, that ability to see straight to the heart of things. And what does your heart tell you about what's coming?" Ezra closed the book carefully, his expression thoughtful. "That we're going to fight for this family, whatever it takes. And that sometimes the things worth having are the things you have to fight to keep." That night, as they prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that surprised them both. Instead of retreating to her own room, as she had every night since their arrival, she knocked softly on Ezra's door. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she said simply when he opened it. "Not with everything so uncertain." Ezra stepped aside wordlessly, and Sarah entered the room that had remained a shrine to solitude for 3 years. She noticed immediately how sparse it was: a bed, a chair, a small table with his journal. The only personal touches were a photograph of Margaret and Emma on the nightstand, and the wooden cross from his pocket lying beside it. "Are you sure?" Ezra asked gently. "I don't want you to feel pressured by circumstances." "I'm not," Sarah interrupted. "I'm sure because I love you. Because I want to be your wife in every way, not just in name or convenience." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable. They'd been dancing around this deepening intimacy for months, held back by respect and uncertainty and the ghosts of their respective pasts. But facing the possibility of losing everything had stripped away pretense and left only truth. "I love you too," Ezra said quietly. "More than I thought I could love anyone again." They came together slowly, gently, with the tenderness of two people who had learned that love was precious precisely because it could be lost. In the quiet darkness of the mountain cabin, with Thomas sleeping peacefully in the next room and danger gathering like storm clouds around them, they chose each other completely. Later, as Sarah lay in Ezra's arms, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced since before Samuel's death. Not the peace of security or certainty, but the deeper peace that came from knowing exactly where you belonged and with whom. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she whispered against his chest, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life, even with all the uncertainty, all the hardship, especially because of it. It showed me who you really are, and who I could become with the right person beside me." Ezra tightened his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the weight of her body against his. "We're going to get through this, Sarah, all of us together, I know." And she did know, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic or odds. They'd survived winter storms and illness, intruders and isolation. They'd built love from loss and family from nothing but need and hope. Whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them as they had everything else, together. The dawn came grey and overcast, heavy with the promise of storms. Ezra was up before sunrise, moving quietly through the cabin to check their preparations one final time. The rifle was loaded and ready, their few precious possessions were hidden, and plans were in place for every contingency he could imagine. Sarah woke to find him standing at the window, fully dressed and alert. Thomas was still sleeping, unaware that this might be the last normal morning they would share in the cabin that had become their sanctuary. "Any sign of them?" she asked, moving to stand beside him. "Not yet, but they'll come. Men like that, they don't make idle threats." Sarah nodded, then moved to the kitchen to begin what might be their last breakfast together in this place. As she worked, she found herself memorizing details, the way the morning light slanted through the windows, the familiar creak of the floorboards under her feet, the comfortable sounds of Ezra moving about his morning routine. Thomas woke with his usual cheerful babbling, and Sarah lifted him from his crib with extra tenderness. He might not remember this day when he was older, but it would shape his future in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "Good morning, little man," Ezra said, taking the baby while Sarah finished cooking. "Ready for whatever adventures today might bring?" Thomas reached for Ezra's face with both hands, patting his cheeks and babbling what sounded almost like "Papa." The word hit them both like a physical blow, a reminder of everything that hung in the balance. "He knows," Sarah said softly. "Somehow, he knows we're his family." As they sat down to eat, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning quiet. This time there were more riders, at least 6 men, including the lawyer and debt collectors from the day before. "It's time," Ezra said, rising from the table. He checked his rifle one final time, then looked at Sarah with eyes full of love and determination. "Remember what we talked about. Whatever happens, protect Thomas first. What about protecting each other?" "That's what I'm doing," Ezra said simply. "Protecting my family." The riders had stopped just beyond rifle range, clearly aware that they were facing a man who knew how to use the weapon he carried. The lawyer called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air, "Mrs. Whitmore!" "We've come for your final answer." Sarah stepped onto the porch beside Ezra, Thomas in her arms, and felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This was it, the choice that would define not just her future, but Thomas's future and Ezra's as well. But as she looked at the men arrayed against them, then at the man standing steady beside her, she realized the choice had already been made. It had been made in small moments over long months, in shared meals and quiet conversations, in acts of service and expressions of love, in the gradual building of trust that had transformed 3 broken lives into one strong family. "My answer is no," she called back, her voice clear and strong. "I decline the inheritance, and I reject any claim on my son's custody." The words carried across the mountain morning like a declaration of war, and Sarah knew that whatever came next would test everything they'd learned about love, courage, and the price of the things that mattered most. The burning homestead down the valley cast an orange glow against the morning sky, smoke rising in a dark column that could be seen for miles. Sarah stared at the distant flames in horror, understanding immediately what the message meant. This wasn't just about debt collection anymore. This was about intimidation, about showing her the consequences of defying men who were used to getting what they wanted. "The Hendersons' place," Ezra said grimly, lowering his spyglass. "Family of 5, including 3 little ones." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Are they? Tracks show they got out in time." "Probably warned by someone who saw the riders coming." Ezra's voice was controlled, but Sarah could see the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. This is what happens to folks who don't cooperate. The message had been delivered with the sunrise, not by the lawyer or debt collectors, but by a young boy from the settlement who'd ridden hard through the darkness. "They said to tell you," the boy had gasped, "that debts get collected one way or another, and that you got till noon to reconsider." Now, with Thomas playing contentedly at her feet, unaware that his world was dissolving around him, Sarah faced the reality that her choice affected more than just their small family. The men hunting them were willing to destroy innocent lives to make their point. "We can't let other families suffer because of us," she said quietly, "and we can't let them think they can terrorize the people into submission," Ezra replied. "Give in to this and it never stops. There'll always be another demand, another threat." Sarah knew he was right, but the knowledge didn't make the choice any easier. She picked up Thomas, needing the comfort of his warm weight against her chest. He looked up at her with those trusting blue eyes, babbling happily, as if this were just another ordinary morning. "What if we run?" she asked desperately. "Take Thomas and disappear into the high country. They can't track us through terrain you know better than anyone, and live like fugitives for the rest of our lives, always looking over our shoulders, never able to settle anywhere." Ezra shook his head. That's no life for a child, Sarah. Thomas deserves better than that. The sound of approaching horses ended their debate. This time the riders came openly, 6 hard men led by the lawyer and debt collectors. But Sarah noticed something different about their formation. They'd spread out, cutting off potential escape routes. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a siege. Mrs. Whitmore, the lawyer called out as they stopped within talking distance. I trust you've reconsidered your position. My position remains unchanged, Sarah called back, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. One of the debt collectors laughed harshly. See that smoke on the horizon, lady? That's what happens to folks who don't pay their debts. Now you can come peaceable-like, or we can make this harder than it needs to be. The woman and child are under my protection, Ezra said, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. You want them, you go through me. 1 man against 6? The debt collector spat into the dirt. I like those odds. Sarah felt the situation spinning toward violence and made a desperate attempt to defuse it. What if I sign over my rights to the inheritance? Put it in writing that I don't want the money? Don't work that way, lady. Your great-aunt was real specific about the conditions. You take the inheritance and live respectable, or the boy gets proper guardians who'll see he's raised right. And if something happens to me, if there's an accident during this collection. The lawyer's smile was cold as winter morning. Well, then the boy would definitely need those proper guardians, wouldn't he? The threat was clear, and Sarah felt fear rise in her throat like bile. These men weren't just after money, they were after Thomas. The inheritance was just a convenient excuse to steal her child and place him with people who would benefit from controlling his future. Sarah, Ezra said quietly, not taking his eyes off the riders. Take Thomas inside, now. But even as she started to move, Sarah saw movement in the trees behind the riders. At first she thought it might be more of their associates, but then she recognized the familiar buckskins and weathered features of Singing Wolf, the Ute medicine man who had saved Thomas's life. He wasn't alone. 6 warriors moved like shadows through the forest, positioning themselves around the clearing. The debt collectors, focused on the cabin, hadn't noticed the new arrivals. But Ezra had, and Sarah saw something that might have been relief flicker across his face. Seems like you boys picked the wrong mountain to make threats on, Ezra said conversationally. One of the riders started to turn, but froze as the distinctive sound of a bowstring being drawn came from the trees behind him. Singing Wolf stepped into view, an arrow nocked and ready, his ancient face impassive. White men, the medicine man said in his careful English, you bring fire and threats to our hunting grounds. This is not acceptable. The lawyer tried to maintain his composure. This is a legal matter between civilized parties. It doesn't concern your people. The woman and child concern me, Singing Wolf replied. They are under our protection, as is the man who showed us respect and friendship. Sarah realized that Ezra's trip to seek help for Thomas had created bonds deeper than she'd understood. The Ute tribe considered them family now, and in this wild country, that meant something the Eastern lawyers couldn't comprehend. Now you listen here, one of the debt collectors started, reaching for his weapon. He never completed the motion. An arrow sprouted from the ground between his horse's front hooves, the shaft quivering with the force of its impact. The horse reared, dumping its rider onto the hard earth. Next arrow finds different target, Singing Wolf said calmly. The fallen rider scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You can't do this. We have legal rights. Your legal rights end where our hunting grounds begin, Singing Wolf replied. And you brought fire to peaceful families. In our law, this makes you enemies. Sarah watched the standoff develop, holding Thomas tightly as he began to fuss, sensing the tension around him. The debt collectors were outnumbered now, caught between Ezra's rifle and the Ute warrior's bows. But she knew that violence, even if they won, would only bring more trouble. There had to be another way. Wait, she called out, stepping forward despite Ezra's protective gesture. Before anyone does something we'll all regret, let me make you an offer. The lawyer looked at her with renewed interest. What kind of offer? A trade. You want Thomas to have proper guardianship? Fine, but let me choose the guardians. Sarah's voice grew stronger as the idea took shape. Ezra McCann formally adopts Thomas as his legal son. I marry Ezra, making us a legitimate family in the eyes of your law. Thomas gets 2 parents, security, and the kind of upbringing that builds character. That's not what the will specifies. The will specifies proper moral guidance and appropriate opportunities. What could be more moral than a man who risks his life to protect the innocent? What opportunity is greater than learning to be strong, self-reliant, and honest? One of the debt collectors started to object, but Sarah cut him off. And as for the debts, if you can produce the original documents proving what my late husband actually owed, not inflated with your interest and fees, then we'll work out a payment plan. But if you can't produce legitimate papers, then you have no legal claim at all. The silence stretched taut as the various parties considered this unexpected turn. Sarah had gambled that the debts were largely fabricated or greatly exaggerated, and she could see uncertainty creeping into the debt collectors' faces. You got 1 hour to produce those documents, Ezra added, his rifle still ready. If you can't, then you and your friends here are trespassing on my land and threatening my family. The lawyer looked around the clearing, taking in the determined faces of the Ute warriors, the steady confidence of the mountain man, and the fierce protectiveness of the young mother. This wasn't going according to plan, and Sarah could see him calculating odds and alternatives. 1 hour, he agreed finally. But this isn't over, Mrs. Whitmore, not by a long shot. As the riders withdrew to consider their position, Sarah sagged against Ezra, the adrenaline of confrontation leaving her shaky and weak. Thomas began to cry, overwhelmed by the tensions he couldn't understand, and she rocked him gently while trying to process what had just happened. You think they'll actually produce legitimate debt papers? She asked quietly. I think they'll produce something, Ezra replied. Whether it's legitimate or not is another question entirely. Singing Wolf approached them, his weathered face creased with something that might have been approval. You fought with words instead of weapons, he said to Sarah. This shows wisdom. I hope it shows enough wisdom, Sarah replied, looking toward the smoke still rising from the Henderson place. Those people lost their home because of us. Those people lost their home because evil men choose to do evil things, Singing Wolf corrected gently. You are not responsible for the darkness in other hearts. But as Sarah held her son and prepared for whatever the next hour might bring, she couldn't shake the feeling that the burning homestead was just the beginning. Men who would destroy innocent families to make a point wouldn't be easily deterred by legal maneuvers or even superior numbers. The real test of their resolve was yet to come. Thomas's first clear word rang out across the clearing like a bell, cutting through the tension of the standoff with startling clarity. Family! The baby had been fussing in Sarah's arms, reaching toward Ezra, when he suddenly spoke the word with perfect pronunciation, as if he understood exactly what was at stake in this moment. The silence that followed was profound. Even the debt collectors seemed stunned by the timing and clarity of the declaration. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized that Thomas, in his innocent wisdom, had just defined exactly what they were fighting to protect. Did you hear that? She whispered to Ezra. His first real word. I heard, Ezra replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached over to touch Thomas's small hand, and the baby gripped his finger with fierce determination. Smart boy! Knows what matters. The lawyer had returned with documents, but Sarah could see immediately that they were hastily prepared copies rather than original papers. The handwriting was fresh, the ink still drying in some places, and the legal language was vague and inconsistent. These aren't legitimate, she said after scanning the pages. These are forgeries, and poor ones at that. The debts are legitimate regardless of the paperwork, one of the debt collectors insisted. Your husband owed money to people who want it back. Then let those people come forward with proper documentation, Ezra said firmly. Let them prove their claims in a court of law instead of hiding behind hired thugs. It was then that Dutch Williams emerged from the tree line, leading a group of men from the trading post and surrounding settlements. Sarah recognized several faces, The blacksmith, the preacher, farmers and trappers who'd heard about the confrontation and come to help. These were people who understood the value of community, who knew that allowing outsiders to terrorize their neighbors set a dangerous precedent. "Heard you boys were having trouble with some visitors," Dutch called out cheerfully, his weathered face splitting into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. The lawyer looked around the clearing, now surrounded by armed settlers in addition to the Ute warriors. The odds had shifted dramatically, and his confidence was visibly wavering. "This is a private legal matter," he protested. "It doesn't concern the rest of you. When outsiders come into our territory, making threats and burning homes," Dutch replied, "it concerns all of us. We look out for our own here." Reverend Hayes stepped forward, his Bible tucked under his arm, but his expression anything but peaceful. "I've been examining the marriage laws for this territory," he announced, "and I'm prepared to perform a ceremony right here and now. If that's what it takes to protect this family." Sarah looked at Ezra, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of love and determination that had carried them through every crisis. "Is this how you imagined our wedding day?" she asked with a shaky laugh. "Can't say I did," Ezra admitted, "but I can't think of better witnesses than people willing to stand with us when it matters most." The debt collectors were growing agitated, sensing their advantage slipping away. One of them, clearly the leader, pushed his horse forward aggressively. "You mountain folk don't understand how the world works," he snarled. "There are bigger forces at play here than your little community can handle. Walk away now, and nobody else gets hurt." "The only one who's going to get hurt," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing, "is anyone foolish enough to threaten women and children in my territory." Sarah turned to see Marshal Tom Bradley riding into the clearing, his badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. She'd met him once at the trading post, a quiet man with steel-grey eyes and a reputation for fairness, tempered by absolute intolerance for bullying. "Marshal," the lawyer said, trying to regain his composure, "thank goodness you're here. These people are interfering with legitimate debt collection." "That's so." Bradley dismounted slowly, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Funny thing about that. Got a telegram from Boston this morning. Seems there's some question about whether these debts even exist." The lawyer's face went pale. "I don't know what you mean." "Mean that the probate court back east started asking questions when they heard about this inheritance business. Turns out your client's great-aunt was quite specific about the conditions, but she was also quite specific about protecting the lady from fraudulent claims." Sarah felt hope surge in her chest. "What does that mean?" "Means that any debts have to be verified by the Boston probate court before they can be collected. And until that happens, any attempt to force collection or interfere with the inheritance is considered fraud." The debt collectors exchanged nervous glances. Their carefully constructed scheme was unraveling, exposed by the very legal system they'd tried to manipulate. "Furthermore," Marshal Bradley continued, "burning down homesteads to intimidate witnesses is arson and terrorism. I've got warrants for the arrest of anyone involved in the Henderson fire. The leader of the debt collectors made a fatal mistake then. Instead of accepting defeat and retreating, he reached for his gun, perhaps thinking he could intimidate the marshal or fight his way out of the trap they'd created. He never cleared leather." Ezra's rifle spoke first, the shot echoing off the mountains like thunder. The would-be gunman pitched backward from his saddle, clutching his shoulder where Ezra's bullet had found its mark. "Next one goes center mass," Ezra said calmly, working the lever to chamber another round. The remaining debt collectors raised their hands, suddenly eager to surrender to the marshal rather than face the combined firepower of the mountain community. The lawyer was already reaching for official-looking documents, trying to distance himself from his associates. "I was merely acting as a legal representative," he protested. "I had no knowledge of any criminal activities." "We'll sort that out back in town," Marshal Bradley said, beginning to secure the prisoners. "But I suspect a judge is going to be very interested in how you came to be working with known criminals." As the immediate danger passed and the prisoners were secured, Sarah found herself surrounded by the community that had rallied to protect her family. Dutch Williams was organizing a group to help rebuild the Henderson place. Reverend Hayes was still prepared to perform a wedding ceremony if they wanted it. Singing Wolf and his warriors were fading back into the forest, their job done. "We did it," Sarah whispered, holding Thomas close as the reality sank in. "We actually did it." "We did," Ezra agreed, but his expression remained serious. "Though I suspect this isn't entirely over. Men like that lawyer don't give up easy, and there are still questions about the inheritance." "Then we'll face whatever comes next," Sarah said firmly. "Together." Thomas chose that moment to repeat his new word, clapping his small hands as he said "family" with obvious delight. The sound drew smiles from everyone in the clearing, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories were the simplest ones. "Think he knows what just happened here?" Dutch asked, grinning at the baby. "He knows what matters," Sarah replied, watching as Thomas reached for Ezra with complete trust and love. "He knows who his family is." As the crowd began to disperse and normal life started to reassert itself, Sarah realized that Thomas had given them something precious beyond measure. Not just his first word, but his perfect understanding of what they'd been fighting for. They weren't just individuals thrown together by circumstance. They were a family, chosen and claimed and worth defending at any cost. The inheritance might still be complicated. The legal challenges might continue, but the fundamental question had been answered by a baby's innocent declaration. They belonged to each other now, bound by love and commitment and the shared determination to protect what they'd built together. Family. It was such a simple word, but it contained everything that mattered, past, present, and future, wrapped up in the unbreakable bonds that connected heart to heart across all the distances and difficulties the world might put between them. The new family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, its leather binding still stiff with newness, its gold-edged pages crisp and clean. Sarah had bought it from Dutch Williams during their last trip to the trading post, along with a bottle of good ink for recording the important events that would shape their family's story. The first entry, written in her careful script, read, "Thomas James McCann spoke his first word, family, on May 15th, 1848. During the day, we fought to keep our home. 6 months had passed since that confrontation in the clearing. 6 months that had transformed their lives in ways both subtle and profound. The legal challenges had been resolved more easily than anyone expected. The Boston probate court, horrified to learn that criminals had been operating under the guise of debt collection, had not only validated Sarah's right to refuse the inheritance, but had also prosecuted the lawyer and his associates for fraud and intimidation. More importantly, the court had recognized Ezra's formal adoption of Thomas as legally binding, cementing the family bonds that had been forged in love and tested by adversity. The adoption papers, signed by a territorial judge and witnessed by half the population of the trading post, now resided safely in the family Bible alongside their marriage certificate. The wedding had taken place a month after the crisis, on a perfect summer morning with the entire mountain community in attendance. Sarah had worn Margaret's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit, with Ezra's blessing and the strange sense that she was being welcomed not just into his life, but into the continuing story of love that encompassed both past and present. Now, as autumn painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, their cabin had truly become a home. Sarah had expanded the garden, putting in root vegetables that would sustain them through the coming winter. Ezra had built additional storage space and improved the barn to accommodate the livestock they were accumulating. Thomas, now over a year old, was walking everywhere on sturdy legs, exploring his world with the fearless curiosity that would serve him well in this rugged country. "Look at him go," Ezra said with obvious pride, watching as Thomas toddled across the main room with determined steps. The tiny leather boots, once too big for his infant feet, now fit perfectly and showed the scuffs and wear of daily adventures. "He's definitely got your stubborn streak," Sarah replied, laughing as Thomas ignored their calls and headed straight for the woodpile beside the fireplace. sees something he wants to investigate, and nothing's going to stop him. They'd settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Ezra rose early to tend the animals and check his traps, while Sarah managed the domestic tasks that kept their household running smoothly. But there was overlap and sharing in everything they did. Ezra was as likely to be found cooking breakfast as Sarah was to be splitting kindling for the fire. The Henderson family had been their first overnight guests after rebuilding their burned cabin, and their gratitude had been both touching and humbling. Other families had followed, drawn by Sarah's reputation as someone who could help with difficult births and childhood illnesses. Word of her skill with healing herbs, learned from Singing Wolf during visits to the Ute camp, had spread throughout the territory. Mrs. McCann, people called her now, and the title felt right in a way that Mrs. Whitmore never had. She was building her own identity here, not just carrying forward someone else's legacy. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, but there was no alarm this time. These were expected visitors, Dutch Williams and his wife Martha, coming for their monthly dinner and to see how Thomas was growing. "That boy's gotten bigger every time I see him," Martha declared after greeting them all with enthusiastic hugs. Thomas, who had no memory of stranger danger, went willingly into her arms and immediately began showing off his newest skill, pointing at objects and clearly attempting to name them. "Dog," he said decisively, pointing at the hound that followed Ezra everywhere. "Book," he added, gesturing toward the shelf of volumes that lined one wall. "Smart as a whip," Dutch observed, accepting a cup of coffee from Ezra. "Got his mother's brains and his father's determination. That's a dangerous combination." "Speaking of dangerous combinations," Martha said with a meaningful look at Sarah, "when are you planning to give this boy a little brother or sister?" Sarah felt heat creep up her neck, but she couldn't suppress her smile. The question wasn't entirely unexpected. She and Ezra had been married 6 months, and in a small community. Such things were always subjects of friendly speculation. "When the time is right," she replied diplomatically, though she couldn't help glancing at Ezra to see his reaction. "Time's always right for babies," Dutch declared. "This mountain could use more young ones, and you two seem to have the knack for raising them." After their guests left, Sarah and Ezra sat by the fire while Thomas played contentedly with his wooden blocks. The evening was peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a day well spent and the promise of many more such days to come. "Do you ever miss it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "The solitude, the simplicity of living alone?" Ezra considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness, and I certainly don't miss the emptiness." Thomas chose that moment to abandon his blocks and climb into Ezra's lap, settling against his father's chest with the absolute trust that characterized all his interactions with the adults who cared for him. The baby's presence seemed to complete something in Ezra that had been missing for too long. "Besides," Ezra continued, stroking Thomas's dark hair, "watching him discover the world makes me see everything fresh again. Yesterday he spent 20 minutes studying a butterfly. Made me realize I'd stopped noticing things like that." "And what about the future?" Sarah asked. "What do you see when you think about Thomas growing up?" "I see him learning to read the weather and track animals, learning to work with his hands and think for himself. But I also see him learning to read books and write letters, maybe even going to school when he's old enough." Ezra's voice grew thoughtful. "This country's changing, Sarah. By the time Thomas is a man, it'll be different from what it is now. He'll need to be prepared for both worlds, the frontier and whatever comes after." Sarah nodded, understanding what he meant. The railroad was coming west, bringing with it all the changes that civilization entailed. Thomas would grow up in a world where the isolation that had protected them might no longer exist, where the skills Ezra could teach him would need to be balanced with formal education and social connections. "We'll make sure he's ready," she said firmly, "for whatever the future brings," as if sensing that he was the subject of their conversation. Thomas looked up at them both with those bright blue eyes and said clearly, "Mama, Papa." The words hit them both with unexpected force. Thomas had been babbling approximations of those terms for weeks, but this was the first time he'd spoken them with clear intention and recognition. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, lifting him from Ezra's lap to hold him close. "Mama and Papa, your family." Later that evening, after Thomas was asleep in his crib, Sarah made another entry in the family Bible. Thomas spoke Mama and Papa for the first time tonight. His family is complete, and so are we. As she closed the book, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 1.5 years ago, she'd been a desperate widow begging strangers for help. Ezra had been a hermit, convinced that love led only to loss. Thomas had been a sickly infant with an uncertain future. Now they were something none of them had been before. A family, not bound by blood or legal documents, though those existed, but bound by choice and commitment and the daily acts of love that transformed a house into a home. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the mountains with white promise. Inside their warm cabin, 3 hearts beat with the steady rhythm of belonging, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. The wooden cross still sat on Ezra's nightstand, a reminder of love that endured beyond death. The toy horse still watched over the main room from its place on the mantel, a bridge between past and present. And the family Bible, newest of their treasured artifacts, held the growing record of their shared story, births and marriages, achievements and milestones, the accumulating evidence of lives well lived and love well shared. As Sarah prepared for bed, she glanced once more at Thomas's sleeping form and felt a peace that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with certainty. This was home. This was family. This was the life they had chosen and the love they had earned through patience and courage and the willingness to believe that sometimes, when you lose everything, you finally become free to find what you were really looking for. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, its own opportunities to strengthen the bonds they'd forged. But tonight, in the warm glow of their mountain cabin, Sarah McCann closed her eyes and gave thanks for the miracle of second chances, for a desperate mother's plea that had been answered by unexpected kindness, for a mountain man's heart that had proven large enough to hold new love alongside treasured memories, and for a baby whose innocent trust had shown them all what family really meant. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing their world in pristine white, but inside the cabin, 3 lives that had once been broken were now beautifully, irrevocably whole. And in the morning, when Thomas woke with his cheerful babbling and reached for the parents who would always be there to lift him up, their story would continue, written not in legal documents or bank ledgers, but in the daily acts of love that build a life worth living, one precious moment at a time.